Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second BMRC 2025 Fellows Fall Speaker Series talk with Dr. Adeoruneya Onyewuenyi, a second generation Nigerian of the Igbo tribe, who is an associate professor of psychology and affiliate faculty of African American Studies at the College of New Jersey. She leads the identity development across the African diaspora IDAD lab. Her research program focuses on social inequity and educational attainment, access, and mental health of racial, racially marginalized and immigrant youth and young adults, and is located at the intersection of education, human development, psychology, and sociology. As an applied developmental and educational psychologist with an emphasis in diversity science, her research program focuses on three primary questions. One, how are racial and ethnic identities constructed, constrained, expanded, and are maintained across varying conditions and context? Two, how does racial discrimination affect academic performance and mental health for Black American and Black immigrant, African, Afro-Latinx, and Caribbean youth and young adults? Three, how do culture and peer relationships influence ethnically diverse adolescents' conflict management skills? She received her PhD and MED in educational psychology from the University of Washington's College of Education and holds a BS in human development with minors in education, psychology, and sociology from the University of California, Davis. Before Dr. Onyewuenyi begins, I'd just like to give a brief overview of the BMRC and the work that we do. The BMRC strives to cultivate and steward a network of all who seek to document, share, understand, and preserve Black experiences in the Chicago metropolitan area. We have currently 28 members, both larger academic libraries and smaller community archives. Our most recent additions to our consortium have been the Haitian American Museum of Chicago and the Chicago Black Social Culture Map. Just want everyone to know that we do have an upcoming 2025 BMRC annual meeting that will be happening in person and online at the Newberry Library on October 14th, 2025, featuring the people who contributed to the book Black Urban History at the Crossroads, Race and Place in the American City. The BMRC's research fellowships have been ongoing since 2009, and we're happy to support this dynamic research. Some of it we'll hear about today. And here are some of the books that have come out that have been produced by BMRC fellows that really add to dynamic narratives about life in Chicago. These fellowships we're able to pay people because of donations we receive. So please do consider making a donation to support this ongoing dynamic research. And without further ado, I will turn it over to Dr. Onyewuenyi.
Our presentation today is about exploring the educational journeys of African immigrant youth in Chicago Metropolis from 1980 to the present. So the purpose of this project was threefold: to document the unique challenges and achievements of African immigrant students in Chicago public schools, to explore the intersections of cultural identity, immigration status, and racialized experiences within educational settings, to assess the role of community organizations, educators, and policies in shaping African immigrant students' academic outcomes. The project sought to capture the layered realities of African immigrant students whose narratives are often remain obscured within aggregate Black categories in research and in policy, especially within education. By pursuing archival research, I aim to uncover both the silences and the stories that help illuminate the experiences of this cultural and ethnically diverse population in Chicago. My archival process revealed both the possibilities and the limits of institutional archives in documenting African immigrant youth's educational experiences. After an extensive online search that confirmed the scarcity of relevant materials, I contacted 3 archives and ultimately conducted in-person visits at 1. Overall, very little focused on Chicago public schools and Black immigrant youth, let alone those from Africa. The Harsh Collection remains a premier site for African American history yet its holdings offered little in the way of African immigrant-focused artifacts, particularly in connection to Chicago public schools. The Harold Washington Library contains similar gaps. University of Illinois at Chicago's special collection is where I located some of the richest but still limited materials. And these included documents on student organization records, community association newsletters, and organization ad books, which I'll talk about. The University of Chicago archives, I made contact, but it yielded no aligned artifacts in terms of Chicago public schools and/or Black immigrant youth, and specifically African immigrant youth. Mainly had personal effects of faculty members focused on African politics and civil wars, which I will also talk about in further detail. To begin my preliminary research, what I did was look at Chicago Public Schools websites for some of their artifacts and information, and they also do not disaggregate their information about the Black youth in their schools by ethnicity. So they have it aggregated by race, and they have ethnicity information for other racial groups, but not for Black. So getting into some of the preliminary findings. So the first was the Ethiopian Eritrean Student Organization at UIC that was formed in during the 2008-2009 academic year. So the first compelling discovery was the creation of this organization. And despite cultural tensions between Ethiopia and Eritrea, students formed a united group with the goal of fostering dialogue, support, and outreach to Ethiopian and Eritrean youth across Chicago. This example highlights both the resilience and the complexity of African immigrant student identity formation, such that being able to get past kind of the Civil War narrative around these groups to form a uniformed student organization. So in the archives, I had seen their application for the student organization. And more specifically, what was highlighted here in red was the purpose and the goal of the organization. And in terms of trying to think about some of their volunteer activities, that they were really wanting to ensure that others learned about and that they did outreach about academic plans and introducing African immigrant youth to UIC. So they noted that they aimed to extend the academic, social, and cultural exchange to Ethiopians and Eritreans in the larger Chicago area, and that they wanted to conduct outreach to Ethiopian and Eritrean youth to encourage them into higher education and introduce them to UIC. This is, again, a unique group given the colloquial and political discourse around these two countries, suggesting that they don't get along, yet here at UIC, they formed as one group. The next preliminary finding was on the Ethiopian Community Association of Chicago, which was one of the few Black organizations that was explicitly engaging school-aged youth. And the artifacts dating from 1989 to 1996 documented various programs ranging from language retention classes to after-school tutoring to computer literacy and cultural shows. So here is from their September 1990 newsletter. And the sections in red document first. Here was in September 1990 noted that Chicago Defender published an article on Ethiopian kids cope with the New World, in which they interviewed some of the kids from the organization to discuss their process of assimilation to the United States. Unfortunately, I was unable to access the Defender article to actually look at as the primary source, but here they talked to some of the kids about their experience. In this section here, there's also the mention of the Korean American Educational Services College, which is a college geared towards multilingual students, such that it would teach English and their native language as long as there was a critical mass of students, so at least 10 students, and had instructors available. And what they were illustrating here was that they were gauging the community's interest and asking those who might be interested to potentially teach there at the school and to have members attain education there. So again, this is one of the few organizations that was actually focused on Black immigrant populations, and more specifically African immigrant populations. Here they have, they were working on teaching their children the Ethiopian alphabet. And so there were 10 kids who had gone through learning the alphabet, and they were moving on to the next stage. They were marking the celebration of them finishing learning the alphabet to them moving on to being able to the next chapter or iteration of their seminar series that would be focused on reading in Ethiopian. And in this section here, sorry, I forgot to box it, there was an insurance seminar that they offered. And what was most particularly telling about this particular insurance seminar that was being offered by Prudential, by one of their local community members who worked at Prudential, was that it was a seminar focused on college funding. Here we have their April 1993 newsletter. And here there are several youth updates that are noted in terms of after-school programs that they do and community-based programming that they did at local parks. And so they were planning to, or talking through, presenting what it is that they had been doing in terms of sports with their youth and what other programming that they were going to be doing in the future. This is especially telling given that some of the work demonstrates how the ECAC was partnered with other organizations to do programming. So this is a letter here from it's called ASAP, the After School Action Program, which serves specifically Edgewater and Uptown, which is where ECAC was located. So it's a network of 25 community-based organizations that has been developing after-school opportunities for children and youth through its member organizations. So the ECAC, as noted here, was one of the member organizations, and there's several different member organizations, over 25 that they had in at least 1996. So it's evidence of their partnership with the after-school organization that one provided different types of after-school and summer programming for African immigrant youth, but also other immigrant populations and other minoritized populations in the Chicago area. And ASAP also provided not just collaborative programming, such as science clubs, the UN Academy, sports leagues, as was noted in the 1993 newsletter, but they also aided the various ethnic organizations with individual programming. So they would provide staffing to do things such as they had noted doing some of the community-based organizing within the parks. They had an annual event, like a gala, to celebrate the achievements of the organization each year. And with that, they had an ad book that also would have letters and stories written by community members. And one of the most poignant ones was this article here written by one of the members who had grown up with and had then gone to college, talking about growing up in America, and most specifically, his theorization around triple consciousness that he experienced as an Ethiopian youth, negotiating both his Ethiopian, his Black American, and his Black male identity based upon learning about Du Bois. And he was a student at UIC. And he also talks about in this story of growing up in America, how he's grappling with broader US identities, Black American identities, but also grappling with various language and cultural tensions. And that it really was a plea to the community to aid and understand what the youth are going through as first or second gen, trying to navigate a new place. So it often talked about straddling Ethiopian and American identities and the struggles some face to retain their Ethiopian identity, and how many of the adults would not see this, should not see this as just them being Americanized. He also mentioned the cultural and ethnic tensions between Ethiopians that were occurring due to ethnicity and language. So not everybody was just Ethiopian is Omaro, right? So by various tribes or different regions in the country, and discussing some of those tensions that were occurring within the Ethiopian community. The author suggests that there are a few ways to help immigrant children retain their Ethiopian identity. So teaching them the language, imploring the ECAC to develop Ethiopian language classes, as we saw that they were providing the opportunity to teach children the Ethiopian alphabet and then work on reading. He also urged them to allow urged adults to allow the youth to spend time with other immigrant youth in safe environments so they have an understanding that they're not alone in the experiences that they have as children of immigrants or immigrant youth themselves. So it often seems like this particular letter, this particular story of growing up in America, seemed like a plea to the adults in the community to understand the trials and tribulations that Ethiopian youth must navigate, and that they aren't any less Ethiopian just because they're not in Ethiopia, or that they dress differently or similarly to their Black American peers. Some additional archival highlights that I wanted to note. So there was the formation of a Habesha student organization, which is a particular ethnic group within Ethiopia that was formed in the 2001-2002 academic year. But what was interesting was that the documents were placed with the Ethiopian Eritrean student organization. And so the coexistence of these groups demonstrates African immigrant youth's attempt to assert both collective and differentiated identities in Chicago's higher education landscape. And it also shows the archive's attempt to thematically collate information that may lack the requisite cultural knowledge or understanding behind why some things are grouped. So by grouping the Habesha student organization with the Ethiopian and Eritrean organization might be a mismatch in understanding what cultural differentiation is within these groups. There was also, in terms of the very little that I did find that talks about African immigrant youth or Black immigrant youth within the schooling system here in the Chicago area, there was quite a bit about the political landscape of Africa and the political wars of the 80s and the 90s that were occurring, and some connections to how some student organizations or local kinds of organizing that was occurring around kind of global conversations of what was happening on the African continent. So for example, here, the African Fund file from 1991 and 1998 had newspaper clippings about Hafsa Abilo and her fight for her father's false imprisonment of treason. Her father had rightfully won the election in Nigeria, but was imprisoned. And then her mother was murdered / assassinated. And it talks a lot about Nigeria's fight for democracy and what happened during the military coup of Abacha's, who was the individual who military coup that ended up taking over Nigeria government in the 90s. So we have these Washington Post pieces here, in addition to some additional editorials and New York Times pieces as well. So often what I was finding was things that were focused on the struggles of this time period of the African continent. So not much focused on the youth or how they're navigating the education system here in the US, but mainly focused on individuals' personal artifacts that focused on kind of as this time article from 1984 focused on Africa's woes. So some of the surprises and barriers that I encountered. Perhaps the greatest surprise was the near total absence of CPS-specific materials related to African immigrant youth. The archives held significant documentation on African and Caribbean politics, as well as general African American educational struggles, but little that spoke to the ethnically diverse Black population of Chicago schools. The silence reflects institutional blind spots and reinforces the invisibility that African immigrant students often face in educational policy, research, and community memory. There were also some barriers that I encountered, right? So the scarcity of disaggregated data from the jump from Chicago public schools. So race and ethnicity are rarely separated in CPS-related documents, erasing immigrant-specific experiences. The archive limitations, such as institutional archives prioritizing larger aggregate African-American history or African politics rather than everyday lives of African immigrants in Chicago. And the geographic focus. So the strongest materials came from community organizations rather than politicians or school systems, suggesting that narratives of African immigrant education are preserved in grassroots rather than institutional spaces. So my future plans are, moving forward, I plan to write a scholarly piece on archival silences, interrogating what stories are preserved and which are excluded when it comes to Chicago's African immigrant communities. And such a piece will argue for the need to diversify archives to capture the lived realities of ethnically diverse Black populations, especially in Chicago, a city that has been a non-traditional immigration destination space for quite some time. Most folks focus on the East Coast a lot of the time when talking about Africans or Black immigrants to the US, especially the Florida, Miami-Dade area, as well as New York or DC. But Chicago has been a hub for African immigrants since the 70s. I want to deepen my engagement in community organizations, specifically reaching out to the Ethiopian Community Association of Chicago, which has existed for over 40 years and has continued with their programming. I plan to explore the possibility of volunteering and inquiring more about their recent archives, whether they have archival documents that they might be willing to have the BMRC or maybe one of the other libraries hold on to, since most of this stuff was from Alderman Helen Schiller's effects from her time in office. This might also potentially uncover richer documentation than what the institutional archives might potentially have in terms of how they've been able to service African immigrant youth and the various other immigrant populations that they serve as well. And then I want to be able to contribute educational scholarship by connecting these archival absences to broader conversations about how African immigrant students are rendered invisible in K-12 practice and policy. This research has the potential to highlight how race, immigration, and identity shape educational outcomes in ways that remain overlooked. So in conclusion, this project underscores the urgent need to tell fuller stories about African immigrant youth in Chicago. While archival silences were frustrating, the community-based materials uncovered revealed rich histories of organizing, resilience, and identity negotiation. The documents I found, ranging from newsletters to student organizational records, illuminate the challenges of assimilation, the pursuit of cultural retention, and the ways youth and families carved out spaces of belonging. The barriers themselves tell a story, one of institutional erasure and of communities compelled to preserve their histories outside of formal archives. In documenting both presence and absence, this project makes clear that the struggles and triumphs of African immigrant youth in Chicago must remain in the margins, but instead move to the center of educational research and policy conversations. Any questions?
That was amazing, Dr. Ada. Thank you so much. Yes, I have some questions to start us off with. I'm assuming that some people in the audience also have questions.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I was wondering about Northwestern. You know, Northwestern University is heralded as having this great African-centered collection. You know, the Herskovits, but I never thought about it not having. Maybe were you able to either physically go or just assess digitally the Northwestern's collections to see if there was anything
No,
that
I
might be?
was not able to, especially because I had found a book by a scholar that was focused on the Haitian immigrant population that I wasn't able to capture. And they said it was at Northwestern, but I didn't have the time to go physically to Northwestern. So that definitely was something that I was interested in. And especially when you had noted at the beginning, the new Haitian library connection as well, that those might end up being sources that could be places to be able to look for some of these kind of silences that are in some of these archives, at least that I was looking at. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, because and so we have Steve Adams, the chair of the BMRC board, is a librarian at Northwestern, and out of his pride, he's putting the link in the chat for us too.
Yeah.
But
Thank
the
you.
Herskovits collection is just heralded as for its African-centered resources. I mean, I personally have benefited from it. I know some people in this room have also benefited greatly from it. But I never thought
Mhm.
about the African youth immigrants in Chicago. I'm not sure about that, what they have, but I think it's a fruitful place to definitely to be in conversation with the archivist there.
Yeah.
So I'll mention a couple of things. I sent you a link to Charla Wilson. Um,
Mhm.
she is the archivist for the Black Experience and has been doing she's made an overt effort in partnership with some other archivists at Northwestern to invite Northwestern student groups to deposit their papers and their historical
Mhm.
records in the Northwestern archive. And I
Yeah.
don't know what she has, but I think if you reached out to her, I think she'd be glad to talk to you if you have not already talked to her.
No, I have not. So thank you so much.
No problem.
Something similarly happened at, because I had done some archival work in California, and Stanford University's archives had recently gotten like all this stuff from the various student organizations there. And so it was able to demonstrate like the long history dating back to the 60s of the African immigrant population and the Black American population being in concert with each other, which was really great.
Yeah, and although her position exists because of um, the Black Alumni Association, which is mostly African American, but I know that there are some African immigrant um, folks who were involved, and I think a conversation with Charla would be great. And as
Yeah.
Sumaya mentioned, the Herskovits collection is one of the best African studies collections in the world, but they collect Africa comprehensively. I don't know that they collect Northwestern's campus comprehensively, but it makes me
Yeah.
want to start a conversation. Yeah, I mean, but also the program in African Studies at Northwestern. I'm sure that they would know about some student groups, and Esmeralda Kale, whose link I will put in next, she's the
Okay.
curator of the Herskovits collection, and I'm sure she would know some things that you would need to hear.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much.
No problem.
Do we have any questions from any of the other people in the audience?
I'll just throw in that I think that, yeah, the work is fascinating and needed. I think especially in, I think sometimes we don't acknowledge, I think um, the struggles around race, particularly in the Chicago area, but I think this is true of many areas where there are really strong or high, Black American populations. There's this tension that gets created between immigrant populations and African American populations, and if we, I think, would join together more and see our interests in common. I mean, when I visited Nigeria and I saw some of the challenges that were there, I heard critiques from Nigerian folks toward me, and I'm like, hey, we have a common struggle. We really do. The colonialism is has done a
Yeah.
number here, and the same folks have done a number on us in the States. And I think we should have more conversations. And so over there and here,
Yeah.
this is not about your research. I'm just ranting, but what you're seeing is I'm reflecting back my excitement upon hearing your research. And I'd love to see how this project evolves. And I'm glad that we've invested in this project. Yay.
Thanks. Yeah, I think one of the things that I was hoping to see, because some of my other work is looking at complicating the notions around the tension that exists between Black Americans and Black immigrants, is to problematize that like it's not all conflict. And so where are the moments of jointness? Where are the moments of joy that is being shared across these groups? And often, sometimes you can see that with the youth. And so trying to kind of look at how are the youth's experiences being captured in the archives, especially as somebody who collects primary data. So getting into the archives in the last year and seeing what is available or not available is also been really enlightening.
I had a question. Am I able to be heard?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, great. Yeah, I'm Nick. Nice to see you and meet you and see this presentation is great. One thing that occurred to me, a lot of what you spoke about was the frustration with the lack of presence in the archive that that you were hoping to find, and it struck me that in the places that you did find it, what you were encountering sometimes was like the institutional density of a particular neighborhood or place in rendering the groups visible. So it made me curious about we talk about kind of immigrant acculturation or self-making. What that path to self-making looks like has a lot to do sometimes with what the extant institutional infrastructure in a neighborhood is for kind of accommodating those immigrant groups. And so those neighborhoods on that North Lakefront that you were talking about, Uptown, Edgewater, Rogers Park, where a lot of African immigrants settled, has had already kind of a deeper reputation as a migrant gateway community for Appalachian immigrants, for Southeast Asian immigrants, Middle Eastern and South Asian immigrants. So it's just interesting that, you know, you find in the archive then a rendering of like, well, there's a template, kind of a community template for this type of acculturation process, and then even, you know, pathways to federal grant making in what you found, to kind of structure these after school, you know, organization experiences. So I don't know, that's just interesting to me, of thinking about maybe comparing what that acculturation and self-making looks like when you have these templates, and what they look like when they're maybe more, I don't know, spontaneous or improvised, in communities that don't have this template already made for here's how we kind of make immigrant ethnic organizations, you know, based on experience. So I don't know if you've had any thoughts about that idea, but
No, I haven't. In going through Alderman Shillman's work, it was very interesting to see how much she supported the ECAC. Like every year they would send a letter to invite her to their annual banquet. And if she wasn't able to attend, somebody from her office did. And like they applied for quite a number of grants for different types of things, such as labor centered or business ownership centered kinds of programming, and always got a letter of support from her office, which I thought was really telling. Like, what does this mean to have an alderman who is committed to the community that is there, and making sure that they're getting the support and the resources that they're applying for? I thought that was really interesting. So I hadn't necessarily like gone out to see, oh, how has the history of the immigrant population in this area, and how does that compare with having infrastructure in some capacity that aids immigrants coming in, especially given kind of the not the newness, but the nascent nature of African immigrants, given that many didn't start to come until really the late 60s, early 70s, and in a bigger boom in the 80s into the 90s.
yeah, thank you.
Thanks. I wanted to, if it's okay, touch on something you mentioned about the Habesha, the records of the Habesha being mixed by an archivist or someone who's working in archives, with the other Ethiopian, making no distinction between different cultural and making the, ignoring distinctions that people might make about themselves, and grouping everybody together because they're from the same geographic area. You talked about, not understanding cultural differences. And so this is one of the things that in terms of archival education and working in archives, we often we're trying to address, right? Like, how do we make sure that the people coming into the field understand cultural sensitivities? We generally talk about this in terms of even American culture, but this is also needing someone to understand culture dynamics that maybe originate outside of America, but also play out in America. And I was wondering, so maybe think about, one of the ways we tend to address it in the US is to say, okay, we need more archivists from those backgrounds. We need them to be in the room. We need them to be a part of that. And I'm wondering, I don't know. I don't know. Most people don't even know archives is a field and that you get a master's degree in it. So probably, and I don't know how prevalent this is, and it's, but also just wondering if we're not able to get people like actually in the library, studying to be archivists or working in them, what do you see as a way to remedy this? How can we, like, either do we produce cultural guides? Can we somehow do some kind of education for archivists so they can understand some of these kind of like cultural
The nuances.
dynamics? Yeah.
Yeah, I think cultural guides could be really helpful. In so many ways, it's like, yes, I'm always like, go back to the community and ask and inquire, right? So how do we ensure that we're using our community as the liaisons and the holders of knowledge and information too, to inquire whether or not we're collating things in the way that like actually makes sense. In talking with my family about some of this stuff, like it was really interesting. I was sharing some stuff because the Civil War has impacted my family. I'm Nigerian, and things that like family hasn't necessarily talked about, but started to talk about as a function of me going into some of these archives and seeing some of these things, that like everyday people don't know that they also have access to the archives. to be able to explore things, but that could be a way to get the community more invested in wanting to come in and check out archives by using them as a knowledgeable base to like double check or as a reference check for how we're thinking through this.
Great, thank you. That's a great point that that does come up of Um, and then most of the time, I already can already hear the archivist saying, "Well, what time do I have to do that?" There's always this the back and forth of how to negotiate wanting to reach out to
Mhm.
community versus like the crunch, the time crunch, and the backlog and things like that. But we have to make an effort. Yeah.
Yeah, making the effort, which is like, I try to think about how do we not reinvent the wheel? So like the mechanism of something like an IRB that the university already has, right?
Mm,
Is there something similar that could be recreated in the archivist kind of space that like alleviates some of that, right? Maybe it's like knowing that we're setting things up and that things are a work in progress. So it's like having folks check it, right? Or in the archives that have the space within the university setting, how do we use our students and our student groups
mm.
as a touch base for us to be able to kind of like, um, alleviate some of that work, do some of the work with us. And that could also in turn aid students in seeing this is what an archivist does. This could be a pathway for them as well.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Dr. Ida.
Mhm.
Are there any more questions from anyone before we end the session?
Thank you so much, Stephen, for all these links. This is so appreciated.
Oh, I'm just
Hi.
nerding out over here, so I'm just adding things. So the
Ca-
Daily
Um,
Northwestern is our student newspaper. So I think you
Mhm.
could search their archives. I think this link I sent you automatically does the search, and you can click load more stories. But the African Student Association's annual culture show is really big here on campus. And I think, yeah, it's a big thing. I think a conversation with Esmeralda would give you some breadcrumbs.
Mhm.
okay.
Because I'm just kind of on the sidelines of it all. But yeah, she's doing
Thanks.
some really,
Thanks, Steve.
she's doing some great work.
Yeah.
Patricia, did you have a question?
Yes, I did. I just want to first say that this was really interesting and I learned so much. So thank you to the center and to the presenter for just sharing this work. My question goes to a comment you made kind of about this tensions between um, when things are institutionalized versus when they're not. And I was wondering if you could share a little bit more about kind of what do you see potentially some of the productive tensions of um, more kind of formal institutions like versus kind of community-based group type institutions, right?
Mhm.
Um, where where do you see the overlap in how they're kind of preserving history, and then kind of where do you see the departures?
I think folks don't know what can be preserved or how to preserve it. So I think in terms of how community organizations might be doing it, I think Chicago is such a unique and the BMRC is such a unique space. It feels like it's tearing down the walls, the divisive walls between academia libraries, local libraries, and community spaces to be able to create these kind of a larger network of resources for folks. And so in some ways, it's like the BMRC is kind of like setting up a template that I would hope to see in other places that can aid in kind of community organizations potentially being able to find ways to preserve the history. And especially for Black people writ large, right? We come from oral traditions. um, Black Americans, Africans, Caribbeans, Afro-Latinx people, we're coming from oral traditions, and the importance of being able to preserve the stories of our communities and what that necessitates and how to do that, I think is something that like folks in the community are trying to figure out. I know at least in mine, this kind of offshoot project my cousin and I have been doing is like whenever we're with our family, and they start telling stories, we just press record on our phone. Just because there's so much that like as the elders are passing, some of these stories are not documented anywhere. And so how can we make sure that these stories continue on? And a thought that I then had was like, where would I give my personal effects to my family, or would I want them to be archived when thinking about like all these personal effects of faculty members at University of Chicago that like got kept. Like to some extent, yes, that's like a bunch of Time magazines, like anybody could find that, but like actually not necessarily. They're just now starting to digitize some of these from the 1900s, right? From the 1950s and such. So it makes me think about like how do we get the information to folks to preserve stories and how to preserve stories and what is the purpose of storytelling and especially of who has access to the stories, especially in communities where we want to keep things guarded. Um, it makes me think about how do we do that? How do these communities do that? And so I think the tension there with how to preserve the stories or who has access to those stories, as a lot of these organizations are like, super grassroots and trying to make a way out of no way and like try to survive from year to year, and maybe eventually get 501(c) status. That makes a difference too in terms of the infrastructure that they have to be able to keep this stuff. That I think now that we're in the digital age, there's access to some of these. There's more access than there was before, but being able to get access to old files that they might have is a question that is still to remain, whether they even have access to that, especially since so much changed technologically wise between 1970 and the 2000s. What folks still have physically, and whom they want to have access to that is something that I think about is tied to some of those tensions that you're asking about.
Thank you so much. If there are no more questions, I think we'll wrap it up, but I would be remiss if I didn't say that our next fellow is actually in the room with us, who'll be presenting, Dr. Nicholas. I'm not sure if I'm going to pronounce your last name correctly. Krzyzka, can you, I don't, so forgive me, I'll look it up and practice before your actual
That's right. It's
day.
Kritschka.
Kriska. Okay. So Dr. Niska Kriska is here, and Dr. Nicholas will be presenting the research that was done this summer on October 22nd, if I'm correct, and we'll be looking at working towards the book project's Schooling, Renewal, Choice, and Community in Post-Civil Rights Chicago, which is a book that is out already under contract with the University of Chicago Press. And if you want to know more about that, you'll have to come on October 22nd, and we'll learn more from Dr. Niska Kriska. But thank you so much, Dr. Onyewuenyi, and I really appreciate and I really learned a lot. I do hope you get to come back and look at some of the other archival materials that we have here. The Haitian American Museum of Chicago has a lot of oral histories. That's the primary base of their records. If you would like to delve into those, we welcome you back. And thank you everyone for coming.